Hi there, everyone. My name is Katie Norton.
My name is Noah Ogletti.
My name is Sanjay Pajas.
I'm Cameron Pope.
And for our presentation, we are going to be talking about the concept of environmental economic modeling, a couple of the economic principles that make up its foundation, and the implementation of these ideas when creating national policies for different countries. So as mentioned previously, we are going to start by defining environmental economic modeling. We're going to go through the history of environmental economics, explain concepts such as green GDP and the ENV growth model, and then highlight 3 different countries who are incorporating environmental economics into their legislative decision-making. So when referring to the idea of environmental economic modeling, we are analyzing the relationship between a country's involvement in environmental policy and overall economic growth. In a definition provided by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, this type of modeling aims to assist governments in understanding the costs of environmental inaction, as well as the benefit of policy action for key environmental issues, including climate change, air pollution, resource use, and the transition to a more circular economy. With global sustainability becoming an increasingly important factor in making legislative and business decisions, the ability to maximize economic efficiency while being mindful of the environmental impact has prompted further research and expansion into this macroeconomic area. So although environmental economics is a relatively new concept, the acknowledgement of environmental factors and their impact on economic progress actually dates back to as early as the 1950s. In 1952, a nonprofit organization was formed in Washington, D.C. called the Resources for the Future, with the group's main goal being to perform research that applied economic concepts to a wide array of environmental issues. As time progressed into the 1960s, the environmental movement gained more attention as the United States Congress passed legislation like the Clean Air and Clean Water Act, which opened the door for the country to make more environmentally conscious decisions. With this trend, however, strong economic growth became synonymous with unsustainable practices. By the 1970s and 1980s, there became a stronger focus on observing the balance between the environment and economics through taking sustainable development into account. In the mid-1980s, the concept of total economic value became implemented as a cost-benefit analysis technique that incorporated the aggregation of various natural resources. And then finally, by the 1990s, environmental factors became indicators based on capital theory of sustainable development, which led to the development of measures such as a revised true green net national product, as well as other calculations for economic progress. So when looking at modern day implementation of environmental economic modeling, measures of economic and environmental efficiency are now being used to reflect overall growth in countries around the world. Some of the most prominent ways environmental economics are impacting international economies are through the calculations of green GDP, the visualization through the ENV growth model, and the additional policies being formed by other countries.
As we see here, green GDP is calculated in the same way which we calculate normal GDP. And we still have the variables for consumer spending, investment, and government spending, as well as net exports. However, you add a calculation for natural capital consumptions. While this is the only difference between the 2 calculations, we have seen over time finding the calculation for natural capital consumptions is very difficult in practice. The different types of natural capital consumptions are reductions in natural capital stock, expenditures on environmental protection, and environmental degradation. Some examples of reductions in natural capital stock are reductions in oil fields or a depletion of timber in a forest. Expenditures on environmental protections consist of air and water pollution control, as well as prevention. Environmental degradation is a measure on the losses of the ecosystem services flows. While these are the main factors in calculating green GDP, in many cases in the real world, A nation will only use one or two of these factors in their calculation to better serve the nation's needs. Green GDP as a concept has been around since the early 1970s. However, green GDP really started to gain traction when green GDP was developed as a method of accounting in 1993, when the UN published a new handbook, the Systems of Economic and Environmental Accounting, the SEEA. This offered a new type of accounting which looked to account the environment in relation to the economy. The 1993 concept focused on the monetary valuation of natural resources. After the release of the 1993 SEEA, many countries across the world began to experiment with this new idea of green GDP. We chose to focus on the countries Norway, the US, and China for our presentation. However, quickly after the development of this idea, countries began to have problems with the calculation of green GDP. Norway and many other countries which use green GDP found that the non-market valuation techniques that were needed to estimate the value depletion of the environment were experimental and inconsistent, leading them to stop calculating green GDP. Other nations like the US and China stopped using green GDP as a measure because the subtraction of the environmental depletion lowered the GDP figure and left growth values close to or at zero, causing concern for the government and citizens alike. For these reasons, green GDP has not been used on a large scale since 2007. However, in 2015, India adjusted its GDP numbers with respect to environmental degradation. While in the eyes of economists, the concept of green GDP was seen as a failure in relation to being an experiment in national accounting, it has helped to gain insight of how the environment and the economy are related.
Okay, so now we'll talk about something about ENV growth model. This growth model is based on OECD methods of economic environmental modeling. So what is it? This is two-sector model that aims at projecting GDP and per capita income levels for all major economies in the world. So it's around 230 countries. The model is based on the neoclassical model of exogenous growth augmented with accumulated human capital. So this is shown in it's based on a slow growth model. And it means that there is some conditional convergence, which is determined by the key drivers of economic growth, which are labor, human capital, physical capital, natural resources, and total factor productivity. This model also explicitly considers energy and some natural resources like oil and gas as productive inputs. So this is very important to take into account. On the next slide is this shown Solow model. So yes, thanks. So how it works. So I hope that everyone know a little bit about the Solow model. So we can see on one axis output per effective worker, on the second on the axis X we can see capital per effective worker, and the most important is equilibrium, where each countries are trying to reach with their income levels, like to converge towards the country specific long-term frontier. So this model is also based on very long-term period. How you can see in the Solow model, it's based on many things like depreciation of capital, production function, savings, and also the rate of growth of population, depreciation of capital, and also growth of technology, rate of growth of technology level of each country. So each country is trying to get in their equilibrium model, so converge to each other. On the next slide is the overview of the modeling framework. So how the growth model, ENV growth model works. So the main concept of what is trying to forecast is GDP. How I said, there are some factors, but here is the table which shows what is the most important, how the model is described. So we can see also total productivity, total factor productivity, physical capital, labor, energy demand, and also natural resources. And so also very important is human capital, also education, and also oil, gas, and things like that, which are taken account and makes the whole concept of the ENV growth model as the whole. It's very important. Yeah, on the last slide of this section, it's ENV linkages models. And it disappeared somehow. I don't know why. So what is the ENV linkage model? ENV linkage model, we can also say that it's computable general equilibrium model. The ENV growth model is like a very important input of this model. It links economic activity to environmental pressure, specifically to emissions of greenhouse gases. And the dynamic calibration of the model has been more flexible by directly linking to the underlying ENV growth model, this so I was said. And it's very important because these two models, like linkage and growth model, are mutually consistent, which makes the whole concept of the environmental forecast or modeling good, what we should consider in our modeling of the long-term economic things to the future. So, okay, and that was everything what I said.
So discussing these three countries, we should first discuss their socioeconomic context in order to understand what's important for each country. In the United States, the GDP per capita was 55,000 and steadily increasing before that. And China's was 7,000, while Norway was sitting at 74,000 with an incline. The population in the United States was increasing steadily before 2015, where it sat at 321 million. And China's population was 1,371,000,000 people. And Norway was trailing both at 5.2 million people in 2015. With an increasing population for the United States, there came a steady population density increase in 2015, where it was 35.1 people per square kilometer of land area. For China, this density was at 146 people per square kilometer. So a big difference there. And Norway was only at 14.2 people per square kilometer of land. In 2014, the unemployment rate for the United States was 6.4%. While this trend was constantly leveling itself out, moving up and down, Norway's unemployment rate steadily decreased before 2014, while it sat at 3.4%. And China, on the other hand, was facing an increasing unemployment rate in 2014 when it sat at 4.7%. So now that that's understood, let's move on to their environmental and resource productivity. So the carbon dioxide emissions are those stemming from burning of fossil fuels and manufacture of cement. They include carbon dioxide produced during consumption of solid, liquid, and gas fuels and gas flaring. In the United States, CO2 emissions per capita are staying relatively level at 16.4 metric tons as recorded in 2013. And in the same year, their carbon productivity was 3.1 GDP per kilogram of CO2 emissions, while this number was steadily increasing before 2013. In Norway, the CO2 emissions per capita has had a slow gradual increase since 1960, with a very brief, sharp decrease between 1985 and 1990, but then began to increase again afterwards, sitting at 11.7 metric tons in 2013. Their carbon productivity has constantly tried to level out since 1990, with sharp increases and decreases through the years until 2013, where it sat at 5.4 GDP per kilogram of CO2 emissions. In China, carbon dioxide emissions per capita gradually increased from 1960 to 2013, where it sat at 7.55 metric tons. And likewise, carbon productivity increased steadily at a high rate because it almost doubled between 1990 and 2000, going from 0.7 GDP per kilogram to 1.36 GDP per kilogram of CO2 emissions. But most recently recorded in 2013, it was at 3.1 GDP per kilogram of CO2 emissions. So from this, we can determine that the United States began to reduce the use of fossil fuels and other carbon emitting sources. China was not as concerned with this aspect because of the steady increases among carbon productivity and carbon emissions with no sign of slowing down. And Norway has tried to keep carbon productivity level and is doing the same with carbon emissions at a slow increase. Looking at these facts, the United States has tried to do the most with green policy platform. And then moving on to the environmental quality of life. When discussing the overall quality of life, the United States has really tried to improve this on all fronts, while Norway has tried to do the same. China, on the other hand, has done nothing to cut down on the extremely high level of population exposure due to air pollution at a staggering 48 micrograms per cubic meter. This is extremely high pollution compared to the United States and Norway at 7.47 and 4.51 micrograms per cubic meter. On the other fronts of access to improved sanitation, water sources, electricity, all countries have increased their percentage of population to have access to these basic needs. So thank you for listening to our presentation and hope you enjoyed it.